Cecil Marsh was 73 years old and had spent 40 years as a software engineer. When his wife died, his daughter called the meeting. The house went, the savings went, the car went. When everything was divided, she pointed at his border collie and said, "That goes too." He said no. That was the only word he spoke the entire afternoon. He picked up his bag and his dog and walked down the driveway, and his daughter stood on the porch and watched him go. What she did not know was that her father had filed 2 patents in the 1990s that had grown quietly into $12 million he had never touched or talked about. He took a bus to a town nobody had heard of and opened a gate that had not been opened in 20 years. What he found on that land rebuilt everything. His daughter drove back 11 months later and stood at the fence line and could not speak. But I need to take you back to the beginning. Cecil Marsh had a way of finding what was broken inside a thing that looked too complicated to understand. Not just in software, though he had done it there for 40 years, writing code for systems that other people used without knowing his name, which suited him fine because Cecil had never needed recognition to feel the worth of what he built. He had learned the skill long before he ever sat at a terminal. He had learned it on a high desert ranch in eastern Oregon during the summers of his boyhood, sitting at a workbench in his grandfather Eldon's workshop while the old man's hands moved over the interior of a watch with the particular patience of someone who understood that every mechanism had a logic to it, and that the logic, once found, made the repair straightforward. Eldon had been a watchmaker in the small town of Darrow for 50 years. He repaired what people brought him, charged what they could pay, and kept records of everything in a leather-bound ledger with a handwriting so careful it looked engraved. He had taught Cecil how to read the interior of a broken watch, the same way a doctor reads a patient, not by looking at what was wrong first, but by understanding what right looked like, so that wrong became obvious by contrast. Cecil had carried that into software engineering without naming the connection until much later. Both asked the same thing. Find the failed component inside a system that looks too complicated to understand. Fix it quietly. Let the thing work the way it was meant to work. He had been good at it for 40 years. He was 73 years old and retired and living with his wife Gloria in the house on Birchwood Lane they had bought when the children were small, when Gloria died in the spring after a winter that had taken more from her than any of them had said out loud. 39 years of marriage, and her absence was not like a sound stopping, but like the air-changing composition entirely. Still breathable, different in every room. 6 weeks after the funeral, his daughter Sylvia called a family meeting. She was 45 and ran a real estate investment firm out of a city 40 miles south with the specific efficiency of someone who had decided early that sentiment was a liability in business and had applied that lesson everywhere, including home. She arrived at the house on Birchwood Lane on a Saturday morning with a folder under her arm and an expression that said the decision had already been made and the meeting was a formality, a courtesy extended because she had been raised to observe certain forms even when the outcome was predetermined. Cecil's son, Raymond, sat beside her at the dining room table, 42 years old, an accountant with a practice in the suburbs, a man who had spent his adult life identifying the path of least resistance and following it with the careful consistency of someone who had confused ease with wisdom. His hands were flat on the table, and his eyes were on the space between his hands for most of the conversation. Sylvia had done her work. The house had been placed in her name 7 years ago through an estate planning arrangement that Cecil and Gloria had agreed to when Sylvia explained it as a tax efficiency measure, and Cecil had trusted her enough not to read the details as carefully as he should have. The joint savings account had been moved into a family trust she and Raymond administered jointly. The car Raymond needed for his commute because his own had become unreliable. She presented these facts with the flat efficiency of someone reporting outcomes rather than making decisions, as though the logic of the situation had produced the conclusion rather than her will. Cecil sat at the table in his own kitchen and listened. He was good at listening. Listening was how you found the failed component. Raymond's hands pressed hard into the table once while Sylvia talked. A brief, involuntary pressure, the kind of thing a person does when something lands in them that they have decided not to let show on their face. Then his hands relaxed and stayed flat, and he did not look at his father and did not speak, and the silence from his side of the table was its own kind of statement. When Sylvia finished, Cecil asked what was left. She slid a document across the table without looking at it. The specific gesture of someone passing something they have already decided is worthless, not with contempt exactly, but with the particular absence of attention that comes from having already moved on in your mind. A deed. His grandfather Eldon's ranch property outside Darrow. 40 acres of high desert, $6,800 in unpaid property taxes accumulated over 17 years at $400 a year. The house unoccupied since Eldon died. She said they had decided to let Cecil keep it since it was technically part of Eldon's estate, and they had no use for it. She said it with the flat generosity of someone giving away something they consider worthless. Then she said Scout would need to go to a shelter. The facility they had arranged did not allow pets. She said this practically, as though she were identifying a logistical consideration rather than a living creature that had slept at the foot of Cecil's bed for 8 years. Cecil looked at his border collie lying under the table with his chin on Cecil's foot, which was where he always lay when Cecil was sitting somewhere long enough to be worth lying beside. The dog's weight on his foot was warm and specific and entirely familiar. He said no. One word. Flat and final and without elaboration. He had spent 40 years knowing which decisions needed explanation and which ones did not. Sylvia said the arrangements had been made and the facility was well regarded and the dog could be rehomed with someone who had proper space for it. Cecil stood up. He went to the bedroom and packed one bag, his clothes, his medication, the leather tool roll that had been sitting in the back of his sock drawer for 17 years, the one Eldon had pressed into his hands the last time Cecil visited the ranch, saying, "These belong to someone who knows how to use them." Cecil had not known what to do with that at the time, but he had kept the tools because he had not been able to find a reason not to, and because Eldon had never given him anything without meaning it. He put the tool roll in the bag and attached Scout's lead and walked out the front door without saying anything to either of his children. Sylvia called after him from the porch that they would drive him to the facility. He kept walking. Raymond stood behind Sylvia on the porch and said nothing. Cecil walked down the driveway he had repaved twice and past the side yard where he and Gloria had planted tomatoes every summer for 31 years, and at the end of the driveway, Scout stopped. The dog turned and looked back at the house once, steady and still and taking it in, the way dogs look at places they have lived in and are leaving. Then he turned forward and looked at Cecil, and that was that, and they walked together onto the street and neither of them looked back again. Cecil walked 6 blocks to a bus stop and sat on the bench with Scout pressed against his leg and counted what he had. $47 in his wallet. The address of Eldon's ranch in Darrow written on the back of a tax receipt he had been carrying since the estate settlement years ago, and a tool roll containing 11 watchmaking instruments his grandfather had used for 5 decades. He also had something his children did not know existed and had never thought to ask about because they had never been particularly curious about the details of their father's professional life beyond the fact of his salary and the size of his pension, and because Cecil had never offered the information unprompted, which he had not. In 1994, Cecil had written a data compression algorithm so efficient that it became quietly foundational to how digital files were stored and transferred across networks. The problem it solved was one that the industry had been working around for years, with solutions that were functional but inelegant. And Cecil had found the elegant solution the way he found all solutions, by understanding the system deeply enough to see the failed component clearly. He had sold the patent through an intermediary for $4 million and deposited the proceeds in a trust account under a name that was not his, and continued living on his engineering salary as though the money did not exist. He had done this deliberately and with full awareness of what he was choosing. He had watched what inherited wealth did to families, had seen it in colleagues whose children had been raised knowing the net was there, who had developed the specific softness that comes from never having had to develop the specific hardness. He had wanted his children to build their own lives, to earn their own footing, to develop the confidence that only comes from having made something yourself without knowing the safety was there. He had planned to tell them eventually. When they were ready, when they had become the people he believed they were capable of becoming. In 1997, he had filed a derivative patent for mobile applications of the same compression technology. That one had sold for $3 million through the same intermediary. He had invested both trusts conservatively and never touched the principal, and met annually with a financial advisor named Howard, who was bound by confidentiality and who had once observed, with the mild exasperation of a professional who had seen too much of the other kind of client, that Cecil understood this money was going to keep growing whether he spent any of it or not, and Cecil had said he understood that, and Howard had shaken his head and written something in his notes and moved on. The two trusts had grown to $12 million. His children had thrown him out with one bag and a border collie because they thought he was poor and inconvenient and past his useful life. They had absolutely no idea. The bus to Darrow left at noon and cost $11 and took 4 hours, and deposited Cecil at a gas station on the edge of town at 4:15 in the afternoon. The attendant gave him directions to the Marsh Ranch without being asked, because in a town of 1,400 people, a stranger arriving by bus with a border collie was an event that sorted itself naturally into the category of things worth noting. Cecil walked the 4 miles to the ranch on a county road with no shoulder. Scout ranged ahead and behind and across the road and back again, reading the landscape with his nose in the specific methodical way of a dog who is gathering information rather than simply moving. The high desert evening was cold and clean, and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the last of the light, turning the sage silver and the distant mountains the specific dark blue that only appears in the half-hour before the blue becomes black. He recognized the gate by the lightning-struck juniper Eldon had refused to cut down for 40 years on the grounds that anything that had survived a lightning strike had earned the right to keep standing. The gate was still there, still hanging on the same rusted hinges Eldon had been meaning to replace, still leaning at the same angle it had always leaned. Cecil pushed it open. The ranch house materialized through the dusk at the end of the dirt track, low and white and much more weathered than Cecil remembered. The porch boards had rotted through in several places. One window on the east side was cracked corner to corner. The paint that remained was the particular exhausted gray of paint that has given up the pretense of being paint and accepted its new identity as bare wood. Behind the house, the old barn leaned slightly to the south, the lean of something that has been tired for years and has decided it might as well show it. But the stone foundation was solid. Cecil could see that from the track, and the chimney was straight. And the structure underneath the weathering was Eldon's structure, built in 1951 from local stone and timber, and the specific intention of someone who understood that a building is only as good as the care that went into its bones. He walked up the porch steps one at a time, testing each board before committing his weight. He found the spare key in the rusted coffee can under the third porch board from the left. exactly where it had always been, because some things do not move no matter how many years go by. The door stuck and then gave when he put his shoulder into it. Inside, the furniture sat under old sheets that had yellowed with the years. The kitchen table was bare, except for Eldon's leather-bound ledger, left open as though the old man had stepped outside for a moment 17 years ago and simply not come back. Cecil set the leather tool roll on the table beside the ledger because it was the one thing he had brought that felt like it belonged somewhere specific, and then he went to find the water pump. The pump was not running. He located the pressure tank in the utility room off the kitchen and could hear from the sound it made when he tapped it that the bladder was shot. A problem he could not solve that evening. He filled a pot from the bottle of water he had bought at the gas station in Darrow and made coffee on the camp stove he had also bought in Darrow, because he was a man who made lists and thought ahead, and $47 had covered what he needed for the first night. He made a bed from sheets he found in the hall closet, fed Scout from the tin of dog food in his bag, and lay down on a mattress that smelled like dust and old wool, and something underneath that he could not name precisely, but that felt like the smell of being somewhere you were recognized, even if no one was there to recognize you. Scout jumped up and pressed against his legs, and Cecil looked at the ceiling in the dark and listened to the high desert night, and thought about the tool roll on the kitchen table, and about Eldon's hands on a watch movement, and about the 40 years he had spent finding broken things and making them work, and whether any of that translated to a house and 40 acres of land and a life that needed to be rebuilt from almost nothing. He decided it did. He slept better than he had since Gloria died. Harriet had been Darrow's nearest neighbor to the Marsh Ranch for 22 years and had developed the self-sufficiency of someone who learned early that waiting for help is less efficient than becoming capable of providing it yourself. She was 69 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had taught every grade from 3rd through 8th at Darrow's single school over a 30-year career, and who had opinions about most things and shared them with the directness of someone who had spent decades in rooms full of people who needed clear communication. She drove over on the 3rd morning when the chimney smoke told her someone had come back to the Marsh property and introduced herself on the porch with a handshake and the information that the water pump pressure issue was almost certainly the bladder tank, and she had a replacement in her barn left over from when she had fixed her own. She replaced the bladder tank in 40 minutes with tools from her truck and accepted coffee from Cecil's camp stove and looked at the leather tool roll he had left open on the kitchen table with the instruments laid out in the order Eldon had kept them. She picked up the smallest screwdriver and held it the way someone holds something familiar. She said those were watchmaking tools. Cecil said his grandfather had taught him. She said her late husband had collected antique clocks, 17 of them. They had not run in 11 years because she had never found anyone in Darrow who knew how to work on them. She said it the way people mention things they have made their peace with, as a fact rather than a complaint. Cecil looked at the tool roll. He said he could take a look if she wanted. He went to her house that afternoon and stood in the sitting room where 17 clocks hung silent on the walls and shelves. Each one stopped at a different time, each one holding whatever moment it had been when the mechanism finally gave out, and nobody had known how to set it going again. He stood in the room for a moment, taking it in, the specific quiet of a room full of things that are meant to make sound and are not making it. He picked up the smallest clock and turned it over and opened the back panel and looked at the mechanism inside with the same attention he would have given a software bug, reading the system rather than the symptom. The mechanism was intact. It simply needed cleaning and the mainspring tension reset. 2 hours of work at most. He sat at Harriet's kitchen table with the clock open in front of him and the leather tool roll laid out beside it, and worked steadily while she brought tea and sat across the table and watched with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who are genuinely interested in what they are seeing rather than performing interest to be polite. She did not ask questions while he worked. She watched his hands and occasionally the clock, and when he finished cleaning and reassembling and resetting the tension, she did not ask if it was done. She waited. Cecil set the hands to the correct time and wound it carefully and held it up. It began to tick. Harriet pressed both hands flat on the table, the way Roy would later press the level flat against a barn joint that had finally come true. The gesture of someone encountering exactness after a long time of approximation. She said her husband had bought that clock on their honeymoon in 1972. She said he had carried it in his lap on the plane home because he had not trusted checked luggage with something that delicate, and he had been right not to. Cecil set it on the table between them. They listened to it tick for a while without saying anything. There was nothing to say that the ticking was not already saying. He went back the next day and the day after that. Within 2 weeks, all 17 clocks were running, and the room that had been silent for 11 years was filled with the overlapping rhythms of 17 different mechanisms, all keeping time in their own particular way, which Harriet said was exactly how her husband had always wanted it, noisy and layered and alive. Word moved through Darrow the way it always moves in small towns, not through announcement, but through the accumulated conversation of people who know each other well enough to know when something worth mentioning has happened. Gideon, who ran Darrow's hardware store, drove out to the ranch on a Saturday morning with a cardboard box of his late father's tools and asked Cecil to look through them and tell him which ones were worth keeping. Cecil spent an hour with the box, examining each tool, explaining what it was for and what condition it was in, and whether the steel was still good. Gideon listened with the focused attention of someone who is actually learning something rather than waiting for his turn to speak. At the end, Gideon said Cecil was welcome to anything in the store he needed, and they would settle up whenever made sense. He said it with the same ease with which Harriet had given her time with the pressure tank, as though the exchange was self-evident and the formal accounting was just a formality they were both too practical to make a fuss about. Cecil began restoring the ranch house using tools from Eldon's barn and materials Gideon sourced for him. He worked the way he had always worked, starting at one end of a problem and moving through it in order. The porch boards, testing and replacing each one. The cracked east window, sourced from a salvage yard Gideon knew in the next county. The bedroom ceiling where water had been finding its way in. Each repair revealed the next, the way they always do in old houses. But the reveals were manageable, and the bones beneath everything were sound. In Eldon's workshop behind the barn, Cecil found what he had not known to look for. On a high shelf behind a row of old oil tins sat a wooden box. Inside were 11 watches, each one wrapped carefully in a square of chamois cloth and tagged with a handwritten label. Each label bore a name and a year. Cecil lifted each one out and set them in a row on the workbench under the single high window where the afternoon light came through at an angle that was good for close work. Then he opened Eldon's ledger and read it properly from the beginning. Eldon had spent 50 years repairing watches for people in Darrow who could not pay him what the work was worth. Every job was recorded in the ledger with the same careful hand. The name, the repair, the amount owed, and beside each entry, in a slightly smaller notation, what had actually been received in lieu of payment. A jar of cherry preserves, and a handshake, 2 days of fence mending in October, a dressed chicken at Christmas, and a note of thanks that Eldon had folded and kept inside the front cover of the ledger where Cecil found it, yellowed but intact, and beside each one, in the same careful hand, paid in full. Cecil read every entry. It took him most of the afternoon. When he finished, he sat for a while with the ledger open in his lap and the 11 watches in their row on the workbench in front of him, and thought about his grandfather driving into Darrow in his old truck to fix a clock or a watch for someone who could pay him in eggs or labor or nothing at all, and driving home again without making a point of it. 50 years of that. 50 years of small transactions conducted in good faith on both sides and recorded carefully so that nothing was forgotten and nothing was owed, and nobody had to feel the weight of a debt that was already settled. The 11 watches belonged to families whose names appeared in the ledger, people who had left them as collateral and never come back to collect, some because they had moved to cities when the local economy contracted, some because they had died, some for reasons the ledger did not record. The tags bore names Cecil recognized from Harriet's stories about the families that had shaped Darrow across 3 generations, and names he did not recognize at all. He did not need anyone to tell him what the watches required of him. He was a man who read systems. The ledger was a system. The logic was clear once you understood what Eldon had been doing and why. Wesley arrived at the gate on a cold morning 6 weeks after Cecil. He was 20 years old, lean and watchful, and had been sleeping in an abandoned grain silo 2 miles east of the ranch for 11 days after losing the farm labor job that had brought him to this part of the state. He had been in and out of the county foster system since he was 12 and had developed the specific careful stillness of someone who has learned that arriving somewhere unexpected always costs something and who has gotten very good at minimizing the cost. He came to the gate with a backpack and asked if there was work he could do in exchange for a meal. Cecil looked at him for a moment. Then he said there was more work than he could do alone, and that the bunk room off the barn had a cot and a working heater, and that supper was at 6. Cecil showed him the bunk room, and Wesley stood in the doorway looking at the cot and the heater and the window with the view of the field. Then he stepped inside and set his backpack down in the far corner very carefully, the specific, deliberate care of someone who has not had a safe place to put their things in a long time. He did not say anything about it. He turned around and asked what needed doing first. Roy arrived a month after Wesley. He was 57 years old and had been living in his truck for 3 months since his daughter had sold the apartment building where he had lived for 11 years and used the proceeds to cover debts she had never mentioned to him. She had called it estate planning. Roy had called it something else, but only to himself, because he was not a man who made a fuss about things he could not change. He had a bad knee from 40 years on the railroad and a spirit level in his shirt pocket that he carried everywhere because 4 decades of track work had taught him that the most important question you could ask about any surface was whether it was true, and that a man who stopped asking that question in his professional life would eventually stop asking it everywhere else. He had heard from a man at the Darrow diner that there was work at the Marsh Ranch and a place to stay for someone willing to do it. He drove up the dirt track on a Tuesday morning and got out of his truck slowly, favoring the bad knee the way he always did in cold weather, and when Cecil opened the gate, Roy did not immediately say anything or pull out the level or explain himself. He crouched down, slowly on account of the knee, and held out his hand palm up for Scout to sniff. He stayed completely still while the dog read him and made its assessment. It took perhaps 30 seconds. Then Scout sat down and looked at Roy, and Roy stood back up and said that was a good dog, which it was, and the way he said it was the way a man says something he genuinely means rather than something he is saying to be agreeable. Then he pulled the level from his shirt pocket and asked where Cecil needed him. Cecil showed him the barn framing that had been concerning him, 2 joints in the north wall that he had not been able to get right by eye alone. Roy checked them with the level and confirmed that one was true and one was off by 1.5 degrees, and showed Cecil where the correction needed to happen and how to make it. He worked methodically and without hurry, and he did not talk while he was working, which Cecil appreciated because he did not talk while he was working either. and a man who understood that about other men was a man worth having around. On the evening the three of them sat together at the kitchen table for the first time, eating food Wesley had cooked from supplies Harriet had delivered in a cardboard box that morning because she always made too much and it was wasteful to let things sit. Cecil looked at the three of them and thought about how they had each arrived. Wesley had come to the gate asking for work in exchange for a meal, and Cecil had offered a cot and supper, and the young man had set his backpack down in the corner of the bunk room with the careful deliberateness of someone who had not had a safe place to put his things in a long time. Roy had come because a man at the diner had mentioned the ranch and had crouched in the cold to let a dog decide about him before he said a word or pulled out his level. Harriet had come because smoke from a chimney that had been cold for 17 years told her someone needed to know about the pressure tank. None of them had been invited. All of them had simply arrived at the point where what they could offer and what was needed happened to be the same thing. And that coincidence, which was not really a coincidence but the result of a small town being the kind of place where information moved at the speed of observation, had produced this table and this meal and this particular evening. Cecil looked at the leather tool roll on the corner shelf and the wooden box of watches beside it and Scout asleep by the stove. He understood something about what Eldon had been doing in Darrow for 50 years that he had not fully understood before, not the specifics, which he had always known, the logic underneath the specifics. The same logic that held a watch in motion, small reciprocal forces, each one invisible on its own, each one essential to the whole. You could not see it from outside. You had to be inside it to feel it working. Eldon had not stayed in Darrow because he had no other options. He had stayed because leaving would have meant abandoning the thing he was building, which was not a business and not a reputation, but exactly this: a table, a meal, people with nowhere else to be, finding somewhere to be. If you have made it this far into Cecil's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you. The letter from Sylvia arrived on a Thursday morning, formal language on firm stationery, the language of someone who has retained legal counsel and wants you to know it. It said she and Raymond had concerns about Cecil's capacity to make sound decisions and his living situation, and that they were exploring legal options regarding his welfare and the management of his estate. Cecil read it twice. Then he set it beside Eldon's ledger on the kitchen table and drove the following day to the nearest city with proper legal services and found Beverly, an elder law attorney whose office was on the second floor of a building on the main street and whose handshake was the handshake of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have seen every variation of this particular situation. She listened to the full story without interrupting. When Cecil finished, she said 3 things. The property trust your grandfather established is irrevocable. Your financial accounts are in structures your children have no knowledge of and no legal access to. And you are clearly of sound mind. She paused. She said she would handle it. Beverly obtained a comprehensive medical evaluation confirming Cecil's excellent physical and cognitive health. She gathered testimony from Harriet and Gideon and Roy about his daily competence and his contribution to the community. She prepared photographs of the restored ranch that told a clear and specific story about the mental state of the man who had done the work. And she prepared the legal response to Sylvia's petition. The response was thorough. It addressed every claim in the petition with documentation and evidence and testimony, and it included, as a supporting exhibit, a certified summary of Cecil's financial holdings, the 2 patent trust accounts, the investment structures, the total valuation, $12 million carefully managed across 27 years. Beverly sent the response on a Tuesday morning. Sylvia received it at her desk on a Tuesday morning and read it alone. Cecil did not know exactly what happened in that room in the minutes after she turned to the exhibit page and saw the certified summary of the 2 patent trust accounts and the total valuation and the 27 years of investment records, each one documented and audited and entirely in order. But he could imagine it with reasonable accuracy because he was a man who understood systems, and the document Beverly had sent was a very precise and complete description of what the system actually looked like underneath the assumptions Sylvia had been making about her father her entire adult life. The assumption that he was modest because he had nothing, the assumption that he was simple because he was quiet, the assumption that a man who lived on his salary and drove a used truck and did not talk about money was a man without any. Every assumption she had built the last 11 months on. The petition, the legal fees, the facility arrangements, the conversation at the dining room table with the folder and the predetermined outcome, and Raymond's hands flat on the surface and the pointing at the dog. All of it constructed on a foundation that the exhibit page dissolved in 30 seconds of reading. She called Raymond. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Raymond told Cecil this later. The specific quality of that silence, 2 people sitting with a phone between them, and no words available that were adequate to what they had just understood about what they had thrown away. The conservatorship petition was withdrawn 3 days later without explanation. No explanation was offered. Beverly said this was not unusual in cases where the evidence was overwhelming. Cecil said he understood and thanked her, and drove back to Darrow in the late afternoon light with Scout on the seat beside him and the high desert doing its evening work on the sky. Harriet had a former student who wrote for the regional newspaper and who had been looking for a story worth telling for several months. She mentioned Cecil and the ranch and the wooden box of watches and Eldon's ledger to him over coffee one morning, directly and without preamble, because that was how Harriet communicated everything. The journalist drove to Darrow on a Saturday and spent 6 hours with Cecil, reading the ledger entries, examining the watches and their tags, listening to the story of how 3 of the 11 watches had already been returned to grandchildren who had not known their grandparents had left anything behind. He spoke with Harriet and Gideon and Roy and Wesley, and came away with a story that ran on the front page of the regional paper the following Sunday under the headline, "Returning What Was Left Behind." The story described the watches and the ledger and Cecil's project of tracing the descendants of the families whose names appeared on the tags. It described the ranch restoration and the community that had formed around it. It mentioned the small foundation Cecil had established to support rural communities through targeted grants that Harriet helped administer from her kitchen table every second Tuesday, funded by a portion of the trust income that had been accumulating for 27 years without ever being spent on anything. The story was picked up by a state publication the following week. The week after that, a national rural affairs newsletter ran a version of it. The foundation received its first outside donation from someone 3 states away who had read about it and wanted to be part of something that worked the way it was supposed to work. Sylvia saw the coverage. She arrived at the ranch 11 months after she had stood on the porch of the house on Birchwood Lane and watched Cecil walk down the driveway. She parked on the road outside the gate and sat in her car for a long time before she got out. The ranch looked nothing like what she had dismissed as worthless. The house was restored and freshly painted. The barn stood straight. The fence lines were true, and the fields had been cleared, and the gate that had been rusting on its hinges for 20 years now opened smoothly when she pushed it. Scout was at the gate before she finished opening it. She stood very still while the dog read her intentions at close range and made his assessment. Cecil came down the track from the house. They stood on either side of the gate for a moment. Sylvia looked at the ranch behind him and then back at her father, and there was something in her expression that had not been there at the dining room table 11 months ago. something that had been loosened by 11 months of sitting alone with what she had done and what she had found out. She said she had not known about the money. Cecil said he knew that. She said she needed him to understand that she had been afraid, that her business was in serious difficulty, and that afraid people sometimes did things that were not who they actually were. Cecil looked at his daughter for a long time. He looked at the woman she had become, and looked for the girl he had raised inside her, and found her there, smaller than she used to be, but present, sitting behind the composed professional surface that Sylvia had built around herself over the years. He said that pointing at Scout and saying that goes too had been the moment. She blinked. He said that the house and the savings and the car were things that could be argued about, that there were at least the shapes of arguments available, even if the arguments were wrong. But pointing at a dog and calling it a logistical problem told him something about how she had learned to see the world that a conversation could not fix. It required different work than a conversation. It required the kind of patient attention you gave a mechanism that had been running wrong for a long time, going back to the place where the error started, understanding why, and making the adjustment from there. He said the door was open. He said it was always going to be open, but that the work of walking through it belonged to her. She nodded, and after a moment she got back in her car and drove down the road, and Cecil watched her go and felt the specific, complicated weight of loving someone who had become a person you did not recognize and believing they could find their way back to themselves if they chose to do the work. Raymond called 3 weeks after Sylvia's visit. Not about the petition or the money. He called because Sylvia had told him what Cecil said about Scout, and he had been sitting with a specific image of himself at the dining room table with his hands pressed flat and his eyes on the space between them, and could not find a way to make that image smaller than it was. He said he had been trying to make it smaller for 11 months and had run out of ways. He said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they have used up all the other options, and the truth is, the only thing left. Cecil said the door was open. He said the ranch had more work than 3 people could comfortably manage, and that a 4th pair of hands would not go to waste if Raymond ever decided to use his. Raymond came the following month. He arrived on a Friday evening and worked alongside Wesley on the north fence line for the entire weekend without asking what he was doing there or how long he was expected to stay. He came back the month after that and the month after that. The visits did not fix what had happened. Nothing fixed that quickly, and Cecil was not a man who pretended otherwise, but they were a beginning, and he accepted them as that in the same spirit that Eldon had written, paid in full, next to a jar of preserves and a handshake. You took what was offered in good faith, and you called it enough, and you moved forward. On a winter morning, 11 months after Cecil had first walked up the dirt track with his bag and his dog, he was in Eldon's workshop cleaning the movement of the last unclaimed watch from the wooden box when he heard Scout bark at the gate. He set the watch down carefully on the chamois cloth and went outside. An elderly man stood at the gate alone. One bag. The expression Cecil recognized completely because he had worn it himself, standing at this same gate on a dusk evening with $47 and a border collie and a leather tool roll and no clear understanding of what came next. The expression of someone who has arrived somewhere they never expected to need to be and has not yet decided what to make of that fact. Cecil opened the gate. He said, "Come in and I will show you the workshop. It is where everything started." The man came through, and Scout fell into step beside him, the way Scout fell into step beside anyone who came through that gate in good faith, which was how the dog seemed to determine these things, and they walked together up the track toward the barn where Eldon's workbench stood under the light from the single high window, and the tools hung on their hooks in the order Eldon had kept them for 50 years, and the wooden box sat empty now on the shelf. because every watch that could be returned had been returned, and the ones that could not had found a home in the Darrow Historical Society's display case on the main street, where people could read the names on the tags and recognize their grandparents and understand something about how this town had taken care of itself across 100 years of hard seasons. Eldon had spent 50 years fixing the mechanisms of broken things. Cecil had spent 40 years building systems that worked so well nobody noticed them. It turned out they had been doing the same thing all along. Before you go, I want to ask you something. How did this story make you feel? Whatever stayed with you when it ended, whatever it brought up in you, I want to hear it. Leave it in the comments below. There is no answer too small, and there is no wrong way to feel about a story like this one. Tell me where you are watching from today. This community reaches further than I sometimes remember, and I want to know where all of you are. And one more thing, think about the person in your life who taught you something with their hands. A grandparent, a neighbor, a quiet man or woman who showed you how something worked and trusted you to carry it forward. If you still have the chance to tell them what that meant to you, I hope you do. Cecil had 17 years between learning and understanding. Not everyone gets that long. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The next story is coming, and I believe it will stay with you.